Hello, and welcome to episode number 2 of the Outdoor Minds podcast. I am your host, Callan Pilmanus, and today my guest is Mr. Randy Newberg. Randy is a well-known personality in the hunting space. He has a popular show on Amazon Prime called Fresh Tracks, as well as the Hunt Talk and Elk Talk podcasts that you can find on virtually all podcast channels. Randy is also a big personality in the conservation world, having had leadership positions with the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and just overall being a very involved human being. Randy took me to school on the history of conservation within the United States, and we had a very robust discussion, I would say, regarding the firearms industry and the funding for conservation that comes from taxation within both the firearms industry and the fishing gear industry as well. I thoroughly enjoyed talking with Randy, as I always do, and I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. And with that, I give you Randy Newberg. So Randy Newberg, thank you so much for joining me on the Outdoor Minds podcast. Randy and I had a phone conversation about, I'm going to guess about 2 weeks ago. And I have been trying to educate myself on conservation in the United States, particularly, and get an idea of where money is coming from. And so, as I mentioned to Randy, the very first episode of this podcast is an interview with Kate Williams, the CEO of 1% for the Planet. Excellent conversation with her, and really it is a great illustration of how private monies can come into conservation and other environmental causes. The organization was started by Yvon Chouinard of Patagonia, and has done a lot of great things in terms of making sure that through private means that conservation receives funding, both from within the outdoor industry and industries beyond. And one of the things I was trying to get an understanding of, as I have been witness to a lot of what I would most politely referred to as pissing contests within the outdoor industry, of where is money coming from. And one of the biggest things that you hear is something called the Pittman-Robertson Act, mm-hmm. which was created in 1937 and funnels a lot of money, particularly from the firearms industry, into conservation. Yep. So here I am, I'm trying to educate myself. I'm thinking, who can I call that has first-hand experience in conservation, who understands the shooting sports industry, and who also happens to have a great financial mind?
Let me get that person for you, Callan. You got the wrong guy.
And so I thought I'd call Randy, and I thought he's not going to return my call. He's one of the most busy people I know in the entire outdoor industry. But Randy, thank you so much for responding and agreeing to be on it. So for the audience who may not know you, mm-hmm. What is your own personal experience just in the broad world of conservation?
Yeah. I grew up in a very subsistence lifestyle, very small rural town in northern Minnesota, where I thought everybody either cooked, caught, or grew whatever they ate. That's how my life was. And so growing up there, I quickly came to understand that it was all about productive land, clean air, clean water. This wasn't about anything other than high quality food of how we put it on our table. And so as an adult, as I got older, obviously you get to see a bigger world. You move away from this little town of 500 people, you go to college in cities of 1 million, and you start to understand that not everybody was spoiled to grow up in this little rural setting that I did. And now I if you look at my adult life, I've spent at least the last 30 years of my adult life involved in conservation issues. And those are heavily tied to public land, clean air, clean water. And I do it mostly through the hunting, fishing, gathering platforms. But I, in my travels to DC and all the national work and stuff that I get involved in, I end up visiting with a lot of people who have a very similar interest to that I do, and they may not come from that hunting, fishing, foraging background. So, if there's one lucky thing about living in Montana, we only have 1 million people, and I can pick up the phone and call my 2 senators, and they'll take my call. And that's not just me, that's almost like most anyone in Montana. Whereas if you live in California or Texas or Florida, your senator is like, call my assistant to my janitor of the chief of staff. So our opinions are sought by those political leaders as they craft legislation in Congress. So I feel like I've had a unique place and space to get maybe a seat in the game that I otherwise wouldn't have had.
I appreciate the amount of humility that you're icing that cake with. But Randy, you have also been involved heavily with the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and have had different types of leadership positions within that. I'm hoping that I could also get you on sometime in the future. If I could squeeze into your calendar once more, just because I for people who are unfamiliar with the hunting side of the outdoor industry, you have built for yourself an impressive media empire, I would say, and you probably wouldn't think of it such, but in a world now that is so heavily influenced by social media, not only have you produced your own television shows, according to the numbers that I see, your current program is probably the #1 hunting show on Amazon Prime, and you have 2 other of your own podcasts. So I appreciate the population statistics within Montana, but you do have a very influential voice with a lot of people.
Well, thanks, Calvin. Part of that comes with having lots of gray hair. Okay, I've when you and I talked on the phone, I had to think about when was the first time I went to Washington, D.C. at the invitation of our congressional delegation to go and lobby on conservation issues. And it was 1998, 22 years ago. I'm thinking to myself, wow, I'm getting old. But with that gray hair comes a lot of relationships, a lot of battles, if you want to call it that. But you learn, you find out. One thing I've learned is that there are allies in places I would have never thought. And there are opportunities at times when I thought it was the darkest and, hope was forlorn. And this whole process of being involved in conservation, no matter which angle you come at it from, is, to me, is so uniquely American and so valuable to what we do, that when I value something to the degree I do of clean air, clean water, and productive lands, that objective is way larger than me or any worries I have about a relationship with this person or that person. So when you look for the common places that we agree on, you can get a lot more done, and it doesn't take nearly as much energy.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, one of the reasons why I started this tiny little podcast was, I've worked in the outdoor industry for over 15 years, and I've been fortunate enough to work with brands that stretch across multiple segments of the outdoor industry. I've gone to SHOT Show, I've gone to Outdoor Retailer, I've gone to ICAST, and what you see is within the greater collective outdoor industry, a lot of kind of tribal thinking, where there's a lot of people who only work in one segment, and out of that natural human tribalism is you look over at another segment and you just assume that they're different people with different values who don't understand your tribe and your way of thinking.
Yeah.
And it's horrible. It's horrible for the consumer. It's horrible for the for the outdoor
Yeah.
for the outdoor participant, and it's horrible for conservation.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Wasted energy.
Yeah. So Pittman-Robertson Act.
Yeah.
Again, my objective is partly to educate myself, but also hopefully be able to transfer any acquired knowledge onto a greater audience. And
Sure.
so I've been trying to understand, okay, where did the law come from, and what has the net effect been? And then it's also accompanied by the Dingell-Johnson Act that was introduced for the fishing industry. So I did a little bit of research and I sent you some of my notes, but I was, context is always important. And, I'm envisioning the United States, around the time of the Industrial Revolution, and where at what point in time in the American persona did conservation enter people's thinking, and so I was trying to, I think kind of visually, and I really like timelines. And so I started reading, okay, when did Henry David Thoreau's Walden come out? 1854.
Yep.
Followed by the book Adventures in the Wilderness by William Henry Harrison in 1869.
Yep.
We have the establishment of the first national park of Yellowstone in 1872.
Yeah, right out my window here.
Don't rub it.
There's a trail from I could walk to Yellowstone from my house here.
Nobody
How spoiled am I, huh?
Nobody like to brag, Randy. Nobody likes to brag. Right.
Sorry, I just had to throw that one in there.
Thank you. Thanks for that. So there's the iconic camping trip that John Muir takes Teddy Roosevelt on in 1903. Boy Scouts of America formed in 1910. And then the 1930s, in the recovery of the Great Depression, the federal government starts a very aggressive expansion of the national park system in the United States. And then in 1937, Congress passes the Pittman-Robertson Act, which introduces an excess tax on firearms, ammunition, and what eventually also encompassed bows, arrows, broadheads, and quivers. I laugh every time I see the word quivers because I don't know how big the quiver industry is.
It's not that big. All it is a device to hold your arrows to your bow.
Yeah. And then in 1941, a similar act is passed in the Dingell-Johnson Sport Fishing Restoration Act, which applies taxes to rods, reels, lures, and flies. And then later, I believe in the 1980s, that tax was expanded to include what appears to be outboard motors and electronic fish finders and gadgets such as those.
Yeah, that's an interesting history. When I talk about this stuff on my podcast, I dig even deeper into the weeds, but because you said you want to keep this to 45 minutes, I'm not gonna get into all of it, but yeah,
Well,
a lot of it.
apply the salt and pepper that's going to make this interesting.
Okay. So I think some of the important things when you study conservation history in the United States is this guy named Darwin. He comes out with this book called The Origin of Species. And it instantly splits America into the Darwin followers and the non-Darwin followers. And most of the people that you will read about in conservation became Darwin followers. And it was a very ideological struggle in the United States. And from that, you get a guy named George Perkins Marsh who writes a book that's very influential. And now all of a sudden you have this whole path of people who are thinking about conservation of species and conservation of landscapes. I mean, Marsh, and I think it was in 1864, wrote about climate change and human impact to the environment. And then along comes what many people will say maybe the most important event in our conservation history is William McKinley gets assassinated in Buffalo, New York in September of 1901. And he's got this crazy guy, crazy wannabe cowboy dude as his vice president named Theodore Roosevelt. And Roosevelt was a very well-to-do Easterner who absolutely detested what he was seeing happening to the Western landscape. He'd been one of the founders of a group called the Boone and Crockett Club. And when he became president, in his presidency, we get the Antiquities Act that was used to establish Grand Canyon National Monument at the time, now Grand Canyon National Park. A bill, an act still in place today that is responsible for just about all of our national monuments, a lot of our national parks. He forms the National Wildlife Refuge System in 1903 with Pelican Island in Florida, much to the chagrin of many in Congress who are like, what's this crazy guy think he's doing? Well, he couldn't find a law that prohibited his executive orders to establish wildlife refuges. So now we've got 150 million acres of our most critical bird habitat that is conserved because some crazy guy named Theodore Roosevelt said, you know what? I'm really big into birding. And back in the mix of all that, he got Audubon and all those folks, George Bird Grinnell. And so out of that comes this idea that the world really hadn't embraced this concept that Roosevelt and Grinnell decided to call conservation, the greatest good for the greatest number over the greatest period of time. Well, who would think that somebody with this crazy theory that is contrary to manifest destiny and the Gilded Age and all that, here comes this guy who says, I'm bringing that whole notion to the White House. I mean, you think about where would conservation in the United States be if McKinley hadn't been assassinated? Not that you want to see a president get assassinated, but it really pivoted conservation in the United States. And then at that time, a lot of the connected people, if you want to call it that, were mostly wealthy Easterners. Roosevelt, the list goes on. And so they were super well connected in the political sphere. So we see the outgrowth of that is the Boone and Crockett Club, the Audubon Society, the Sierra Club, a lot of those groups that start using their political pull to say, we're going to do some things. So one of the big things at the time was the depletion of our bird species for nothing other than the vanity of women's fashion. Well, out of that comes the Audubon Society, started by George Bird Grinnell. And Roosevelt was cheering the whole way he could. They get, after Roosevelt's time, they get the Migratory Bird Treaty Act passed. There's just so, if someone wants to really have a fascinating dig into the world, reading and understanding how conservation came about in the United States is really an exercise in culture, in social, economic, politics. It's a study in all that, but to the point we're talking about, 1937, think about this. The worst depression in the history of the United States. The dirty 30s, the Dust Bowl is dumping the soil from Kansas into the Atlantic Ocean. The dirt from the Dakotas is landing in Lake Michigan. And I mean, it is as bad and ugly as you can imagine. And along comes this crazy guy, Key Pittman, a senator from Nevada, gets together with Albson Robertson, a congressman from Virginia, and they come up with this idea. Well, I shouldn't say they come up with it. This idea had been proposed many times, but it had been defeated. Well, somehow these two guys go to FDR, who's trying to turn the economy around, trying to, he's got the the Conservation Corps, he's got the Work Projects Administration. This is all before World War II, where he really has his hands full trying to get the economy back on its feet. And here comes two guys with a piece of legislation that says, oh, and by the way, we're going to tax these hunters and shooters 10 or 11%. In your mind, you think about, in the darkest of times, who's going to put themselves in the crosshairs, literally and figuratively, of an extra 10 or 11% tax on something they enjoy doing? So the context of all that, when you look at the political times, the economic times of when the Pittman-Robertson Act was enacted, it's just remarkable to me that it came about. I ask hunters today, shooters, if the Pittman-Robertson Act was not in effect today and hadn't been in effect for the last, whatever it is, 83 years, what would you think if someone came and said, I'm going to put a 10% or 11% excise tax on your firearms and ammunition? They'd be marching with pitchforks, burning down state capitals. There'd be the 3 million camouflage march in Washington, D.C. or something.
I could already see the Facebook and Instagram memes of "Shall not infringe."
Yeah,
not infringe.
Right. So part of the beauty of history is it happens for reasons, but you kind of move forward from that. And I'm thankful that at that time we had leaders who said, you know what, we are going to voluntarily tax ourselves because we care that much about wildlife. At the time, Aldo Leopold had not written the Sand County Almanac and had not become the voice of the conservation movement in the United States. And to see people come forward with that idea is super remarkable in my mind. And it passed without that much opposition. So then shortly after that, seeing that success, Dingell from Michigan and Johnson, senator from Colorado, they picked up the pieces of the efforts that had been made to try replicate that in the fishing space. And I think it was the late 40s or 1950 when they finally got it passed. I can't remember. But anyhow, it's the same thing. Applies to fishing tackle and boats and motors and all the stuff that you mentioned. So it funds billions of dollars of conservation in the United States. And for those who pay some of those taxes with our purchases, I would not want that to go away. I realize that the context of today, we probably couldn't get it passed today, but I certainly don't want it to go away. I want that tax to stay in place because it's so critical to the funding of wildlife and conservation.
That's great. And for the audience's benefit, as I have been kind of scratching the internet, trying to pull data on these pieces of legislation and what they contribute. So what I found was between, unfortunately, data for Pittman-Robertson and data for Dingell-Johnson are not housed in the same central area, and they're not reported on the same. The inefficiency of our federal government.
I suspect you probably came up, if you added the two, you ended up with a number slightly north of $2 billion.
Yeah, around there. So between 2013 and 2016, the average fiscal year Pittman-Robertson was pulling into the federal Department of Interior, where the funds go, was bringing in around 800 million per year.
Yep.
And then the Dingell-Johnson Act in 2017 pulled in 1.4 billion. So between those two acts, we're looking at somewhere, yeah, to your point, cresting $2 billion a year.
Yeah. And the cool part of that is states get that money returned to them. There's a strange formula. It's partially based on geographic size, and then partially the other half is based on how many licenses do they sell to hunters and anglers. So it's a mix that ends up getting the money sent to the states. So it comes into the states in these earmarked accounts. And there are significant restrictions on diversion of any of those funds. So in these sub-accounts, the states have to apply to use those funds that meet all these criteria for conservation, for clean water, for access sites, for all these things. And they have to put some skin in the game too. It's a maximum is a 3-to-1 ratio. So $3 of PR or DJ money. Here I am using these acronyms again. I'm sorry. Pittman Robertson. It's not, when we say PR in the hunting space, we're not talking about public relations. We're talking about Pittman Robertson. And DJ isn't the guy who spins the records on the radio anymore. It's the Dingell-Johnson. So in these sub-accounts is the money, and the states say, hey, we've got this, can we get a 3-to-1 match? So 25% is coming from license sales, and 75% is coming from those sub-accounts. And these programs get audited by the Department of Interior to make sure there's no diversion. And if you divert any of it for an unauthorized use, big problems, which is how it should be. That's what the money's earmarked for.
Yeah, which is how it should be. It seems every election, my wife and I are reviewing our ballots and all of the propositions. We live in Oregon, and I have no political affiliation. I'm an independent voter. If you took my temperature, I probably lean more libertarian than anything. But as I look at the libertarian platform, like if libertarians had it their way, Yosemite would be a condo complex.
Yep. That's right.
Yeah. But every time I look at proposed taxation, and they say, well, this will be reserved for city parks, or this is going to be reserved for education. I got to confess the level of skepticism or cynicism that I feel towards whether it's state, local, or federal government, and them honoring the intended purposes of any funds that they're asking for.
Yeah. It's in Montana. Our state agency got audited, and they'd not inadvertently, the legislature had come in and put a line item in the state wildlife budget that said you're going to use X amount of this to help with, I can't remember what it was. It's something to do with either rodent or predators for landowners. It was not a legal use of Pittman Robertson dollars. It was like $900,000. Mm-hmm. So when you do that 3-to-1 ratio of how much you got to pay back, it was really painful. This was in the late 90s, I think. So anyone who at that time was thinking, oh, these, this is kind of a fuzzy, whatever I want to spend it on thing. No. There are people within every state wildlife agency who are the dedicated expert on use of these funds and what can be allocated. So it gives me comfort.
I hate to sound, I don't want to say this the wrong way, but I do take heart in the idea that there have been examples in the fairly recent past of people receiving some kind of penalty for the misappropriation of funds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things I know here in Montana, when our state legislature, we meet for 90 days every 2 years, and we always joke that, well, we wish that they met for 2 days every 90 years. But when the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks budget comes forward, most hunters and anglers are looking at that pretty close because we want to make sure that There's nothing in there that's going to be a diversion of these funds or inappropriate use. And we have a pretty strong attachment to that. Money came from our pockets, for lack of a better way of saying it. We want to make sure it's used for the intended purpose.
I think you touch on something that maybe you're more optimistic about the awareness than I am.
Maybe.
But, it's, you talk about firearm sales, right? And so the Pittman-Robertson Act taxes. If you look at the distribution of tax revenue, it disproportionately comes from firearms and ammunition sales.
Yep. Oh, by far. Yes.
And when we talk about the history of that act and the mindset of the people in government on the time, and the extraordinary event that they were able to pass that legislation, the modern day outdoor enthusiast might ask him or herself the question, well, why firearms? Like, why tax firearms?
Right.
And I think if you look at history and you look at the history of the outdoor industry in terms of brands and manufacturers and the type of gear that was available to consumers at the time, there wasn't an outdoor industry as we know it today to tax.
No, there was no Patagonia, REI, there was no, North Slope, there was no, I don't know, I think all the companies that are around today, most of them were not in existence then. And the one thing that most people use for that outdoor pursuit of hunting was a firearm and ammunition. And so that was, given the context at that time, that was the most logical place to place that excise tax. And it's an excise tax paid by the manufacturer. It's not a retail tax. It's an excise tax at the manufacturing level.
Yeah. So we talk about, other I'm browsing my notes here. But the one of the oldest brands in the non-firearms, fishing space is Coleman, right?
Yeah.
I don't think Coleman even got started until, my notes aren't very organized, but I don't think Coleman got started.
It was like somewhere in the 19 teens, I think.
Right,
right. Something like that.
And so and I use Coleman because it's like, that iconic American piece of gear that virtually every outdoor enthusiast would have been using, but it still wasn't that big. You're talking about wool clothing that you were also using, to just be in any type of outdoor environment. The notion of specialized clothing, specialized equipment that you purchase for the explicit use of enjoying the outdoors. I mean, that just wasn't part of consumer mindset back then.
Nope, wasn't.
And so when we talk about $2.2 billion a year, and that's before the state funding. So you add 25% to that, that's funded by the states. Okay, well, how does that compare to funding for conservation that's coming from the private sector? And so scratching and clawing at the internet, trying to pull that data out, it is almost impossible to find accurate data on the spending on conservation from the private sector, right? And so just statistics that I found. So in 2017, funds donated to the category that is called animal and environmental charities amounted to 11.83 billion in 2017.
Yep.
Part of the problem with this federal statistic is the amount of categories of organizations that are glommed into this almost $12 billion. So this includes everything from animal rights organizations such as the ASPCA, as well as zoos and aquariums. And it also includes just the environmental category and organizations that support global initiatives.
Right.
So if you're trying to isolate monies that just flow to the United States, it's almost impossible. So included in this is also, the African Wildlife Foundation and the World Wildlife Fund. And by no means am I trying to paint any of these organizations in a negative light, but as we try to assess conservation within the United States and where monies are coming from, it's virtually impossible when you were trying to assess the private sector.
Yep. Yeah. And a lot of, the part of what came from the concern people have about nonprofit organizations saying this is what I use my money for is a group called Charity Navigator. And if you took that list that makes up that total dollar amount and said, all right, you got to be somewhere maybe in the top third of ratings of Charity Navigator to say that you actually spend your money on what you say and not on salaries and, all the other stuff. That helps bring the pool smaller, but you still don't know exactly where the money is coming from and where it's going to go. So I know people who've tried to do that. I appreciate that you tried to do it. It's most people who try to do that say, I think I'm going to go golf today.
Yeah, well,
that's frustrating.
I suppose the COVID quarantine is working in our favor, that I have free time to scratch the internet and try to find this stuff unsuccessfully. I haven't yet posted it, but if you can find time to watch my interview with Kate Williams of 1% for the Planet, she actually makes a really interesting point in terms of the value of the private sector and of the nonprofits versus the public sector, and these tax monies that are flowing into the Department of Interior and then therefore flow to the states. She kind of described it as filling in the cracks. And you, as someone who's been involved with Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, knows this very well. Oftentimes on a government level, there's these broad initiatives, but these broad initiatives can't by any means cover all of the needs that we have as a country in terms of programs and corners of the environment or corners of wildlife that for whatever reason just get neglected because there's just not enough monies to go around.
Yeah. And, I come from the hunting space mostly. And so I look at Ducks Unlimited through private donations. They have conserved 15 million acres of wetlands. When you think about the critical nature of wetlands in our country, all that they do for water quality, for everything else, that's not something that the federal government was able to jump in and do. And the same year Pittman Robertson came in, that's the year Ducks Unlimited started. Then you look at the Nature Conservancy. In the West, some of the most critical wildlife grounds that we have come up on the auction block, and there's no way the BLM, the Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, any of those federal agencies can move fast enough or get appropriation from Congress to acquire those critical lands. So along comes the Nature Conservancy, has put millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. The Trust for Public Land, the same thing. The Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, all of these groups that are large landscape initiative kind of organizations have taken these private dollars in the form of donations, fundraisers, grants from other nonprofits, and they've conserved millions and millions of acres of habitat that I think about where would we be without some of those groups I just rattled off, and I could rattle off even more of them. I mean, it's it's impressive, the land trusts in this country, how many acres they have conserved for the benefit of all of us, for us as humans and our need for wide open places and wild spaces, but also the wild things that live on those landscapes. So yeah, that number is significantly larger than what government funding is for these programs.
Yeah, I'm going to use that as a very natural segue into to the topic of the outdoor industry.
Mhm.
And you know, if you get a membership statement from REI or you shop at a Bass Pro or Cabela's, you know, you always see examples that these organizations are writing articles about or putting plaques on their walls in a retail location about you know, the funds that they send to support a whole myriad of conservation organizations. I would dare to say that as outdoors enthusiasts, as consumers of gear, that we should be cognizant of where we spend our money, and we should encourage companies of all types that support the outdoor industry through gear to do their part and contribute to some type of conservation. You know, there's no if there's no outdoor industry trade show, there's no SHOT Show, there's no ICAST if we do not have a healthy planet that allows us all to go out and pursue our passions. Um, so with that, I wanted to do an exercise, financial exercise that calculates the financial impact of excess taxes on the goods that we purchase.
Yep.
Now, one of the reasons why Randy Newberg, at least in theory, a great guest to have on this topic is because Randy spent a uh, a good portion of his life as a CPA. Please correct me if I misspeak.
I hope that this was my last tax season. And with any good fortune, my 33rd tax season was my last tax season. So yeah, I've been at the number counting for a long time.
Right. Okay. So so now here's the dangers. I'm a marketing guy, right?
We'll cut you some slack though, Callan. Don't worry. You don't need to qualify that.
Okay, great. So as a marketing guy, I try to get an understanding of how excess taxes, where do they show up in a financial statement? Now, I want to make sure for the audience that this isn't the moment in time where everyone tunes out and goes, this is super boring, and shuts off. But my understanding is that in a financial statement, where excess taxes show up is in the walk from gross sales to
Net income.
gross profit, right? And so, thank God, I don't have to do any calculations between from the gross profit on down to net income, because you don't want a marketing guy touching that stuff. But with that, and you seem to agree with this assessment. So hopefully my math stands.
When I looked at your math, I went out and did some research from the outdoor retail industry itself, just to confirm that they would think your calculations are somewhere in their same ballpark. And I think if anything, you might have been even more precise than they are at time. So I sent you that link of the one. Just the bigger picture is when OR talks about excise taxes on them, they usually say that a 5% excise tax will add 7 to 10% to the end retail price. So that's you're actually pretty close when you went through your exercise. So.
All right. So from your lips to God's ears. All right. So here's what I did. I used Smith and Wesson as the example. Number one, because Smith and Wesson, as its current format, as a corporation, is publicly traded, and a vast majority of its revenues come from firearms.
Yep.
You go into their, I believe it's their 2020 10K, and they call out explicitly the dollar figure of their sales that come from firearms. So according to their 2020 fiscal year, $529.6 million of their revenue came from firearms. Now, with the disproportionate ownership globally of firearms that happens in the United States, I made an estimation that if 75% of those revenues came from the United States, that would be $397.2 million of taxable firearms revenue that should be impacted by excess taxes. That means that on $397.2 million of revenue, that $39.7 million in one fiscal year would have flowed from the Smith & Wesson Corporation to the Department of Interior. So now's the time to call me on my BS, Randy.
Oh, it's there. You get into all this crazy accounting stuff about that, of what's the cost versus wholesale. So right. For your exercise, it's worthwhile. You're close.
By comparison, so the standard bearer when it comes to voluntary charitable giving for environmentalism in the outdoor industry is Patagonia, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. Yvon Chouinard is led by example in that to the highest degree.
Right, and as proof that I have here,
I saw that back there.
The statistics I'm about to give are not designed to paint Patagonia or any other, let's call them traditionally green brand in the outdoor space negatively. Yvon Chouinard has done more for conservation, putting his money where his mouth is, and challenging other people to do the same than anywhere else. Furthermore, I would also suggest that the money that companies like Smith & Wesson put towards conservation isn't done voluntarily. This is a tax.
Mandatory. Yep.
Right. So that contribution doesn't come out of the goodness of their heart. Right? This is something that who knows, maybe they wouldn't have paid if they had the choice to pay it or not. So by comparison, even though Patagonia is a privately held company, Google estimates Patagonia's annual revenues at this point in time at around $750 million globally. Assuming that Patagonia is limiting their contribution to conservation financially at a 1% contribution, according to the whole 1% for the planet mantra, that would put them at $7.5 million. So again, Smith & Wesson through taxation, $35 million a year. Patagonia through voluntary contribution. And actually, if you go to their website, they describe it as they are voluntarily taxing themselves, which is another way to look at it, right?
Yep.
So by comparison, Smith & Wesson is likely contributing 5 times the amount of money to conservation than Patagonia is, right?
Yeah.
Now, if I really wanted to promote this podcast with the most inflammatory title, I could do that, but that would be a little bit that would be more inflammatory than I want to be. And so then we go, okay, well then what is the impact to retail prices that these excise taxes, as you pronounce it, probably the right way to pronounce it. Um, what's the impact? And so what I did is I looked at the Smith & Wesson Shield, which right now is probably their most popular pistol on the market. Retails for the list price for $479. If you're pulling, flyers from the newspaper, you could probably find it on sale for $350. Let's assume that retail margins in the firearms category, they're notoriously low. So let's just say it's 30%. And then most retailers in the United States don't buy directly from the manufacturer. They buy from a distributor. And so there's also the distributor margin in there.
Yep.
If we assume a 15% distributor margin, according to my calculation, there is about on a firearm that retails for $350, the amount of taxes dollar-wise that's going to the federal government is a little over $20, $20.83 according to my calculation. And therefore, the impact to the retail price from selling to a distributor sells to a retailer sells to a consumer, you're looking at over an 11% impact to the retail price. Well, that means that on a $350 firearm, over $35 of that retail price is the impact of the excess tax on that. So one could argue that without an excess tax, a Smith & Wesson Shield pistol would go for $315 versus $350.
Yep.
Now,
you should become an accountant, Callan.
No. Okay, so now we know that Patagonia taxes themselves at 1%. I use the same math. It shouldn't be the same math because that charitable contribution should come from much lower down on the income statement. Randy's nodding, so I feel okay about that assumption. But for the sake of lazy math, let's say that I chose Patagonia's their Nano Puffer jacket, which is probably one of their most popular garments. It retails for $199. I'm assuming a 45% retail margin. Now, to be fair, Patagonia has both their own retail and they sell direct to consumer, and they sell to retailers such as REI and the like. So
definitely a much higher margin in dry goods than there are in firearms.
Yeah. So, but about 45% retail margin. So that gives a wholesale price of $109 with a 1% tax on that. That's $1.09 that is going to Patagonia's charitable contributions, and then the impact to the retail price of that garment is about $2, right? So you should feel good that every time that you buy a $200 Patagonia garment, that about $2 of that goes back to the environment. That's awesome. Well, what would happen if Patagonia was taxed like the firearms industry is taxed? They have a different distribution model. They're not necessarily flowing as heavily through distributors. A lot of their revenue is going either direct to consumer or it's going direct to a retailer without an additional middleman there. But according to my calculation, if they were to get hit with a 10% excess tax as pistols are taxed, you're looking at about between a $17 and $18 price increase on a $200 garment. So that Nano Puffer would retail for about $119, according to my calculation, which is about a 9% increase to the consumer.
Yep, you're right within what OR would have projected.
So Randy, why do you think that these type of excise taxes haven't reached a broader spectrum of goods?
I think it goes back to some of what I said earlier, where just the historic context of people and business and how business was done back in 1937 or 1950 is different than it was today. Most manufacturing occurred on this soil, not overseas. Just a little history. In 1990, in the late 90s, it eventually got proposed as legislation in Congress in 1998 called Teaming with Wildlife. They called it the backpack tax. Okay, it was going to put a much smaller excise tax, anywhere from 1 to 5% on binoculars, backpacks, bird seed, the things we're talking about, tents, sleeping bags. And it brought the outdoor retail industry to a tighter focus of who they are and who they represented. And they got that, this was the irony of being involved in that. And when I say my first time back in 1998 was when I went to DC to lobby on legislation, it was this bill. It eventually became CARA, Conservation and Reinvestment Act. But as it ended up getting introduced, OR got all that excise tax stuff taken out of there. And I think that's a reflection of a couple things. It's a reflection of a different time and place than it was in 1937 or 1950. It's a reflection of the fact that OR does most of their manufacturing overseas, so they're going to be subject to tariffs. But it's for those who pay the excise tax, and you listen to the arguments. So when I say pay it on firearms and fishing and bows and arrows, I'm happy to pay it. I am, and I think most, like I said earlier, most hunters and anglers would not want that tax to go away. And we listen to the reasons and the rationale of why the outdoor industry says we are opposed to an excise tax. They're hard pieces. The paths of logic are kind of hard to follow. One of the most common ones is, well, you never know if that piece is going to be used for outdoor activity. True. Well, I look in the hunting and shooting space. I think 60% of handgun, rifle, and ammunition sales are in the non-hunting space now. Well, that 60%, these are just recreational shooters. These might be home defense people. They might be whatever reason they want to own a firearm. They aren't using that for conservation. They aren't using it for the thing. So for every time one of these discussions is brought up, it's like, well, we're already swimming that water. One of the reasons it's brought up, I said it earlier, is tariffs. They say, well, we manufacture mostly overseas, and so we're subject to tariffs, which is the equivalent of a tax. Well, for most most rifles, firearms, ammunition is made in the United States. It could be made overseas. Some is.
Well, I would say Glock, right? So,
yeah. So, yeah. I mean, there's a bunch of companies in Oregon who manufacture in the firearm space. They could move overseas, but they choose not to. So the idea that somehow I've moved my business overseas for my production for lower costs, which, hey, as an accountant, when you let the accountants run the business decisions, they're going to tell you to move overseas. Even after paying the tariffs, you're still further ahead because of cheap labor, cheap materials, everything else. But is that really a discussion you want to use as your rationale for why pitching in to even a smaller degree, 1 to 5% instead of the 10 and 11%? I mean, I'm all about clean air, clean water. I don't care where it comes from, who's responsible, where the funding, the volunteerism, the advocacy. I mean, I've got so many friends in the outdoor space, and I collaboratively work with so many groups that are in what would be land trusts and other, not what you would think of in the hunting space. it doesn't really matter to me where it comes from. And I accept the fact that history has led hunting and fishing down a path that this is where we're kind of at, and we're going to keep paying that tax. And after seeing how powerful outdoor retailers were in getting themselves exempted from an excise tax in the multiple times it's been brought up, I've just accepted the fact that, you know what, it's probably not going to happen, and that's fine. Let's just do what we can. So when Yvonne and others come forward with the idea of 1% for the planet, great. You know, get after it. I think it's helpful. And so I sent you a link earlier from Outdoor Retailer Institute or Foundation, whatever it is. And it's their long dissertation about, you know, it says no excise taxes, exclamation mark, in big bold print, which makes it pretty easy to understand what their position is about any excise tax, and then the rationale for why they feel they should not be subject to excise taxes. And that's fine. You know what? I don't have the energy to argue that. It's just wherever someone can chip in, wherever someone's willing to help, let's just go do it. There's so much important work to be done in conservation and in conserving landscapes. I'm not going to waste any of my energy fighting over who should pay what. You know, it's kind of like when I go out to dinner, I'm not going to argue with someone about who's going to pick up the tab. Let's just have a good dinner, and we'll sort out the tab later.
I think in a Mr. Rogers Neighborhood style of wrapping it up, of what did we learn here today, kids, is you know, number one, for a tax that's existed since the 1930s, the consumer today is blind to it. The average firearms enthusiast, unless he or she reads an article and then goes and does the research and discovers, you know, the percentage of the $350 pistol that they're buying that goes to taxation, they otherwise would be blind to it. And these types of legacy taxes are something that consumers have just been absorbing. The market has just been absorbing. It's just part of doing business. It's just the cost of doing business nowadays. But
it would take a generation, but 10, 20 years from now, if there was a tax on bird seed and binoculars and backpacks and tents, that generational transformation, they wouldn't even notice it 20 years from now. It'd be built in.
Right. And in a world of ultra partisan politics, where our federal government is likely not to introduce any meaningful or any additional meaningful legislation, I think it's then upon the consumer to spend their money wisely, to support brands that are supporting their passions, not only through the gear that they're making for you, but also, you know, doing their part to contribute to conservation, both in the United States and globally. And, you know, to encourage brands that maybe aren't contributing as much as they could to get involved and do something meaningful.
No, I think that's a great way to approach it. And, you know, through the leadership that Yvonne has shown, there's now models mimicking that in the hunting space. Now we have 2% for conservation. And what it is to be a certified company in the hunting space and fishing space, you have to give 1% of your revenue, and you have to donate 1% of your time for you and your employees to conservation. And so from his idea, there's just millions that are being done in 1% for the planet, which is great. But there's going to be copycats of that. And I don't think in the conservation or outdoor space, anyone has a patent on good ideas or ways to do things. It's all about what's our shared goal. Like you said it earlier, if we don't have clean air, if we don't have clean water, if we don't have these wonderful public landscapes and other conserved landscapes in our country, none of us, I don't care which angle we come at this from, we don't have an activity that's dear to our heart. And so I just I went through this phase of being kind of bitter about the teaming with wildlife thing, but I've gotten over it. I've just, as I've grown older, I've come to understand, you know what, history sets everything down its own path, and along the way the path changes or whatever, but I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to say, hey, what are we doing for wild things in wild places, and let's go do it.
Randy Newberg, I so appreciate your time. You made this discussion so much better than if I were to tackle.
Callan, I appreciate you reaching out to me. I got this phone message in like Oregon. Well, my son lives in Oregon. I got a ton of friends in Oregon. I don't know who this is. I better take it. And it's you. I'm like, hey, what are you doing, man? So I appreciate you.
All right, man. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much. And we'll talk soon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Callan.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, was Randy Newberg. Find him online at randynewberg.com. His TV show Fresh Tracks with Randy Newberg can be found on Amazon Prime. His podcast Hunt Talk Radio and Elk Talk can be listened to wherever you stream your podcasts. He can also be found on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Our theme song is 500 Miles, composed by Barry Manning and performed by The Capacitors. Check them out at thecapacitors.com. Thanks again for tuning in to another episode of Outdoor Minds. To learn more about the program, our guests, or me, your host, visit us at outdoormindspodcast.com. God bless and see you next time.